Power never begins with strength, it begins with submission. That is the first law few dare to understand. The world believes that dominance comes from willpower, from the raised voice or the clenched fist. But the philosopher knew better. He had seen men who ruled empires yet trembled before their own servants, and servants who obeyed for years only to inherit everything once their masters fell. Obedience, he said, is not weakness, it is rehearsal. Every act of obedience shapes the mind like a blade hidden in silk. The one who bends learns the rhythm of command, the one who kneels memorizes the face of authority. Over time, obedience becomes a mirror through which power studies itself. Those who learn to obey too perfectly forget where their soul ends and another's will begins. They speak the words given to them, smile when told to smile, and convince themselves that virtue lies in compliance. Yet beneath the quiet exterior, a storm gathers. The philosopher spoke of a servant named Aurelian. For 12 years, Aurelian carried messages for a minister who ruled through fear. Each order, each command, was delivered with absolute precision. He never faltered, never questioned, never failed. The minister grew to trust him more than his own kin. But trust in the world of power is never safety, it is exposure. Aurelian learned his master's habits, how he thought, how he lied, how he hid fear behind a calculated pause. In serving him, Aurelian absorbed his methods, his mannerisms, even his tone of speech. And when the time came, when the minister's enemies closed in and his empire began to crumble, Aurelian did not run. He simply stood where his master had once stood, repeating the same words, giving the same orders. No one noticed the difference until it was far too late. The philosopher paused, letting silence fill the hall. "Do you see?" he whispered. "Obedience is the apprenticeship of power. The loyal are not harmless, they are waiting." He described obedience as a form of spiritual possession. When one submits long enough, the mind begins to dissolve. The thoughts of another seep into one's veins until one no longer knows who is speaking within. That is how ideologies survive, how tyrants are born, how generations repeat the same mistakes in different names. Power feeds not on strength, but on surrender. It thrives on those who cannot tell the difference between discipline and devotion. And yet, the philosopher did not condemn obedience entirely. He saw in it a paradox. The seed of mastery is hidden inside servitude. Every future ruler must first kneel before someone else. To understand power, one must feel its weight pressing down. Only then can one learn how to lift it. He said the wise obey, not because they are weak, but because they are learning the art of control from the inside. In the audience, a young listener raised his hand. "Then how does one know," he asked, "when obedience becomes a chain?" The philosopher smiled faintly. "When silence begins to feel holy," he replied. "When the act of pleasing another feels safer than facing yourself, that is when obedience turns from a path into a prison." The candles flickered as he spoke. The air carried a strange heaviness, as if the room itself remembered every command ever given within its walls. He continued softly, "Power, in its infancy, hides behind humility. The ones you trust most deeply are those who have studied your mind through their silence. Beware the gentle, the compliant, the perfectly loyal. They are rehearsing your language, so they may one day speak it against you." He closed the book before him, the echo sharp as a blade. The students leaned forward, uncertain if the lesson was warning or prophecy. "Understand this," he said finally, his voice sinking to a whisper. "Every kingdom falls not by rebellion, but by obedience fulfilled too perfectly. What you call loyalty is often the shadow of ambition." He stepped back into the dim corridor, his reflections swallowed by candlelight. Somewhere beyond the walls, a faint sound echoed, the slow rhythm of footsteps learning the pattern of command. And as the hall grew silent, a new question began to take shape. If obedience births power, then what births identity? The philosopher's voice carried softly through the darkened hall, still echoing with the lesson of obedience. He spoke again, slower now, as if each word was a thread pulling the audience deeper into silence. "After obedience," he said, "comes the second illusion, identity. A man spends years perfecting the face he shows the world, not knowing the mirror, shows it back distorted. Power demands masks, and the clever soon learn that survival depends on which mask fits best. At first it feels harmless, a polite smile, a measured word, a gesture rehearsed to please or to deceive. But performance once begun rarely ends. Identity becomes performance, and truth becomes unbearable." The philosopher told of Lucian, a scholar who sought truth in every shadow. He believed the world admired honesty, so he built his life around being the honest man. Each conversation, each gesture, became a demonstration of moral purity. Yet behind closed doors, Lucien felt hollow, as though every truth he spoke belonged to someone else. The world praised him for his integrity, and he began to believe it. The lie grew roots not because it was false, but because it was worshipped. As the years passed, Lucien no longer searched for truth, he searched for audience. His virtue became theater. And when the applause faded, he felt panic, as if silence erased his existence. The mirror, once a reflection, had become his judge. He could no longer see his face without wondering who was watching. The philosopher's tone darkened. The greatest tragedy, he said, is not to be deceived by others, but to be deceived by one's own reflection. The man who builds himself for admiration becomes dependent on eyes that are not his own. He moved toward the candlelight, his features half hidden in shadow. Identity, he continued, is the most elegant prison. You choose the bars, you polish them daily, and call it your character. He recalled an old parable, a sculptor who carved his own likeness so perfectly that people came to see the statue instead of him. At first, he felt pride, then jealousy, finally despair. He began to destroy the statue, only to find that each strike against it scarred his own face, for he had spent so long shaping his image that his soul had fused with it. The philosopher turned toward his listeners. The more perfectly he controls his image, he said softly, the less he knows who is underneath it. A murmur rippled through the hall. The young listener from before spoke again. Then how does one live without the mask? He asked. The philosopher smiled faintly. You don't, he said. You learn to see the mask for what it is, a mirror that lies beautifully. The danger is not in wearing it, but in forgetting it was ever made. He stepped closer to the nearest candle, and its flame trembled, distorting his reflection across the silver tray beside it. Look long enough into your reflection, he whispered, and it begins to look back, not as you, but as what you've become to others. That gaze will consume you if you let it. He spoke then of rulers and lovers, saints and killers, all trapped in the same silent performance. The tyrant who becomes the image of fear, the lover who becomes the image of devotion, the philosopher who becomes the image of wisdom. Each forgets the one who began beneath the mask. The mask doesn't hide the self, he said finally, his voice almost fading into the dark. It consumes it. The hall grew utterly still. The candles hissed softly, their smoke curling upward like fading ghosts. Somewhere in that silence, the lesson of obedience merged with this new revelation. First the servant loses his will, then the master loses his face. The philosopher closed his eyes. Power, he said, first takes your freedom, then your identity. What comes after, he paused, is far sharper. And as he turned the next page of the forbidden book, the word blade appeared, a warning, a transition. The philosopher's fingers rested on the open page, the word blade shimmering faintly under the candlelight. The students leaned forward, their breaths shallow, as though sensing that what came next would draw blood, not from the body, but from the mind. Power, he began, is not given, it is taken, one cut of conscience at a time. He spoke of power as an art of dissection, a slow, deliberate separation of what must live and what must die within us. To rule, to lead, even to survive in the dark theater of the world, one must learn where to place the blade. Not in flesh, but in feeling. Not in others, but in the illusions that bind us to them. Those who rise, the philosopher continued, must learn to wound without flinching, to separate morality from survival. Mercy is a virtue of those who have never starved for control. He paused and lifted a small silver knife from the table. It wasn't a weapon but a letter opener, dull, ceremonial. Yet under the dim light, it gleamed with quiet menace. This, he said, is what the human mind becomes when it decides to be more than human. The story he told next was of Saren, a strategist in an empire of deceit. Saren began as a man of conscience, believing justice could be maintained even in corruption. But the higher he climbed, the more he saw that those who hesitated became tools for others' ambitions. So he adapted. The first cut came when he betrayed a friend to protect the state. The second when he justified it as duty. Each act stripped away a layer of doubt until he no longer remembered the warmth of hesitation. He began to see the world as a chessboard of necessary sacrifices, and himself as the only one fit to move the pieces. But as his mind sharpened, something else dulled. The sound of laughter no longer stirred him. Faces blurred into functions. His victories tasted like ash. He had carved out the weakness in himself so cleanly that even joy bled away. The philosopher's voice softened. Every blade that cuts outward eventually turns inward, he said. You cannot wound the world without teaching your hand how to wound you. He let the knife fall onto the table with a quiet clang. The echo lingered like a heartbeat. Power is not a possession, he continued. It is corrosion. Every act of dominance eats away at the conscience until nothing remains but control itself, raw, mechanical, soulless. The young listener from before raised his voice, trembling slightly. Then is morality an illusion? Is conscience the enemy of survival? The philosopher smiled, not kindly but knowingly. No, he said. Conscience is the echo of what power costs. It's not the enemy, it's the price. The wise do not silence it. They learn to hear it, even as they bleed. He stepped away from the table, his reflection wavering in the polished blade. The danger, he whispered, is not in using the blade, but in believing you can control where it cuts. Outside, thunder rolled faintly as though the sky itself agreed. He sharpened his mind to conquer others, the philosopher said, and found it was himself bleeding. The candles flickered wildly for a moment before steadying again. The air carried a scent of iron, imagined, yet unmistakable. He turned toward the class, his gaze colder than before. And so, he said, the third truth of power reveals itself. To cut away morality is to begin the slow death of the self. He closed the knife, sliding it back into its velvet case. The next illusion, he murmured, is subtler. You will not feel its cut, only its weight. And as the last flame dimmed, the philosopher whispered the title of the next chapter, The Law of Hidden Hands. The philosopher lingered in silence after the lesson of the blade. The echo of metal still hung in the air, sharp and invisible. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, but heavier, as if it carried the weight of unseen chains. Now that you understand a wound, he said, you must learn the hand that wields it. He turned toward the audience, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. Every system of control, he continued, depends on one illusion, choice. The students exchanged uneasy glances. Choice, the word itself sounded holy, sacred, even human. The philosopher let their thoughts wander for a moment before shattering them. You were never free, he said, only given paths that lead to the same end. The walls were built long before you were born, and every door you opened was placed there to make you believe you found it. He spoke then of the city of mirrors, an ancient capital governed not by kings, but by merchants of thought. Its citizens prided themselves on freedom, hundreds of markets, thousands of voices, infinite options. Yet every decision, from what they ate to whom they loved, was subtly directed by unseen architects. The streets were designed to lead to the same plazas, the shops sold the same desires wrapped in different symbols, and the laws that promised liberty were written in a circle. One day, a thinker named Mara began mapping the city. She traced every route, studied every rule, and discovered that no matter which direction one chose, every path returned to the same central tower. The revelation destroyed her, for she realized that freedom was not abolished, it was manufactured. The philosopher paused, his eyes distant. You see, he said, true masters never need to command. They simply create a world where obedience feels like free will. He looked at his students, faces pale, caught between fascination and fear. You think you choose your career, your love, your beliefs, he continued, but the seeds of those choices were planted by the hands you cannot see. Culture, desire, fear, the invisible architects of your mind. He drew a circle in the dust on the table. Power is never loud, he said. It whispers. It teaches you the shape of the cage and calls it comfort. A student finally spoke. Then how does one escape? The philosopher smiled faintly. By realizing there is no outside, he said. Only awareness. Freedom is not found in rebellion, but in seeing the design clearly enough to stop worshipping it. He moved toward the window, where moonlight traced thin bars across the stone floor like a prison of light. The true rulers, he whispered, do not dominate the body, they colonize the mind. They do not punish you for disobedience, they make disobedience feel wrong. He turned back, his eyes glinting with quiet fire. The deepest control is not domination, he said, it is belief. Make a man believe he is free, and he will gar his own chains. The hall fell utterly still. The students sat motionless, as though afraid that even thinking might betray them. Somewhere in the silence, the philosopher's words sank like seeds into the soil of their minds, unseen but already taking root. He closed the ancient book before him. "You now know the law of hidden hands," he said. "But beware, once you see the puppet strings, you begin to question who pulls your own." The candles trembled. The shadows on the wall seemed to move on their own, as if invisible fingers guided them. The philosopher's gaze followed their motion with quiet reverence. "When belief becomes the instrument, even betrayal feels like destiny," he murmured. He turned the next page, and the room seemed to darken with it. The philosopher's tone grew quieter now, almost mournful, as though the weight of his own words had begun to exhaust him. The air in the hall seemed denser, the candlelight softer, trembling with the pulse of unspoken guilt. He stood before the audience, hands clasped behind his back. "You have learned of the blade," he said, "and of the hidden hands that guide it. But even the most carefully constructed power must pass through one final crucible: trust." He turned toward the students, eyes half-shadowed. "Trust," he said slowly, "is the philosopher's stone of human nature. It turns weakness into gold. At its heart, every empire, every love, every alliance depends on the fragile illusion that someone else will protect what you cannot. Trust binds armies, binds lovers, binds the mind to the unknown. It is not logic that holds societies together, it is faith in another's silence." But the philosopher warned that such faith is the most dangerous element to touch, for it transforms or destroys everything it contacts. He told the story of Cassion, a physician who served a dying king. The king trusted no one but him, not even his blood. Cassion had healed him from poison, comforted him through sickness, and guarded his secrets for years. But one winter's night, when rebellion stirred outside the palace walls, Cassion discovered letters hidden beneath the king's bed, promises of peace written to the very rebels he claimed to despise. It was then that Cassion's faith cracked. Every word of loyalty he had spoken now felt like mockery. And so, when the rebels arrived, Cassion opened the gates. He told himself it was justice, that he was ending tyranny. Yet when he watched the king fall, he realized the truth. He had not betrayed out of righteousness, but out of fear, fear that his devotion had been meaningless. The philosopher's voice softened to a whisper. "Betrayal reveals what we truly worship: security, ego, or love. We call it survival," he said, "but the mirror calls it fear." He walked slowly down the aisle between the students, their faces frozen in uneasy contemplation. "Understand this," he continued. "Betrayal is not an act of hatred, it is an act of preservation. The traitor always believes he is saving himself. That is why he sleeps at night while others bleed." He stopped beside a trembling student, a young woman clutching her notes tightly. "Have you ever wondered," he asked her, "why the ones closest to us are always the ones who destroy us?" She did not answer, but her silence was enough. "Because only those who know where you are weakest can touch the place that breaks you," he said. "That is the alchemy of betrayal. It requires intimacy." The philosopher returned to the front of the room. His gaze swept across them all like a slow tide. In love, betrayal is the shadow of attachment. In politics is the cost of ambition. And in faith is the echo of doubt. No power survives it, yet every power depends upon it. He leaned forward, resting a hand upon the ancient desk. "The irony," he said quietly, "is that the betrayed and the betrayer are often the same soul, divided by fear." Outside, a faint wind moaned through the corridor, rattling the shutters. The philosopher looked toward it as if hearing an old ghost whisper its confession. "Cassion's story," he said finally, "ends like all stories of betrayal, not with victory, but with silence. He became the king's new healer, not of bodies, but of lies. And in serving the next ruler, he learned the final truth: once a man betrays to survive, survival becomes his only faith." He closed the book gently, the sound echoing like a heartbeat fading into stillness. "To betray is to transform," he murmured. "But transformation demands a cost: obsession." He lifted his eyes once more, and the candlelight caught the edge of a faint, knowing smile. The philosopher's words about betrayal still hung in the room like the scent of extinguished smoke. His audience sat silent, haunted by the idea that trust could be both sacred and deadly. But as he turned the next page, his expression changed. The sharp edge of reason softened into something almost sorrowful. He looked up and said quietly, "After betrayal comes something more consuming, the sickness of the soul that refuses to let go." He paused, then continued, "Obsession begins as admiration and ends as a cage. At first, obsession feels pure. It begins with the warmth of fascination, the intoxicating pull toward what we find beautiful or unreachable. It is born from longing, a desire to touch what the mind can only imagine. But slowly, admiration hardens into hunger. The thing admired becomes the thing needed, and once it is needed, freedom ends. The philosopher walked slowly toward the window, the candlelight tracing his outline, like gold bleeding into shadow. The human mind, he said, cannot love without wanting to possess, cannot admire without envy. That is why every saint secretly envies the sinner, and every lover fears the beloved. He told the story of Elias, a painter who once loved a woman not for who she was, but for what she reflected back to him: perfection, purity, a vision of beauty that made his own chaos bearable. He painted her endlessly, her face, her hands, her smile, each portrait more lifeless than the last. He no longer saw her, he saw his own idea of her, frozen in color. One day she left, and when she did, Elias did not paint again. He destroyed every canvas, slashing them open until only fragments remained. But what shattered him was not her absence, it was the realization that he had never loved her at all. He had loved the version of himself that existed when she looked at him. The philosopher turned back to his students. And in the end, he said softly, obsession is only the mirror of emptiness, shaped like someone else. A murmur moved through the crowd. The young listener, voice trembling, spoke again. Then is love always selfish? The philosopher smiled faintly. Love, in its purest form, seeks union, but obsession seeks reflection. Is the ego disguised as devotion? He picked up a piece of broken glass from the desk, perhaps once part of a mirror, and turned it in his hand. Look closely, he said. Every obsession hides a void. It begins as the attempt to fill that void with another, but ends with the void consuming both. He set the shard down. Its fractured surface caught the candlelight, multiplying it into distorted shapes. He thought he was chasing her, the philosopher whispered, but it was his reflection that ran. He began to pace slowly, his voice deepening. This is the cruelest truth of obsession. The more you chase what you desire, the further you drift from what you are. The soul becomes addicted to pursuit, not possession. The chase becomes a heartbeat, and when it ends, the silence feels like death. The students listened, transfixed, as the philosopher's tone darkened further. That is why the obsessed destroy what they love. The moment they touch it, the illusion collapses, and they are forced to face the emptiness behind their need. They cannot bear the stillness after the hunt. He closed his eyes, as though seeing something long buried. And so every obsession is an architecture, he said. A structure built from longing, layered with illusion, sealed by fear. And like all great architectures, it eventually collapses under the weight of its own perfection. The room grew colder. The candles flickered, their flames bending toward an unseen draft. And when the obsession breaks, he murmured, what follows is silence, and within that silence something begins to watch. He looked to the door, where the light no longer reached. The philosopher's final words on obsession faded into a stillness that felt almost sacred. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The students waited for him to continue, but for the first time, he did not. He simply stood there, eyes distant, as though listening to something beyond sound. The silence stretched on, heavy and deliberate. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their eyes. And then, finally, he spoke, softly, but with the weight of revelation. Power ends where speech begins. He let the sentence hang. You must understand, he continued, that words are the weakest instruments of power. They explain, justify, defend all acts of submission. Those who speak too much reveal too much. Those who seek to persuade confess that they lack control. He moved toward the center of the hall, his steps echoing faintly. Those who truly understand the code no longer argue, plead, or persuade. They simply remain silent. Silence becomes a weapon, a mirror, and a throne. A young listener raised his head, frowning. But isn't silence cowardice? The philosopher smiled, not mockingly, but with quiet pity. No, silence is dominance refined. The coward hides behind silence to avoid conflict, but the master uses it to command it. The difference lies in intention. Silence, when chosen, becomes language without words, and fear without noise. He paused, watching the flicker of a candle as its flame bent and straightened again. Consider this. The moment you defend yourself, you have already surrendered authority to the one who accused you. But remain silent, and they are forced to wrestle with their own uncertainty. They begin to speak more, reveal more, unravel themselves in the space you leave untouched. The students listened, entranced. Each could feel the truth of it in their own lives, the times they spoke to prove worth, to be understood, and found only weakness in the attempt. Silence, the philosopher continued, is not absence, is presence distilled to its purest form. The one who masters silence commands a room without moving, rules the conversation without words. Power, at its end, becomes quiet, because nothing greater remains to be said. He told them of Seraphine, a ruler who never raised her voice. Her counsel argued endlessly, philosophies, wars, faiths, and she would simply listen, hands folded. When they finished, her silence filled the room like smoke, suffocating their noise. In that silence, men betrayed their own positions. In that silence, kingdoms bent. Her reign was not marked by speeches or decrees, but by the unease she left in every pause. Her enemies called her heartless. Her allies called her divine. But in truth, she had learned what others feared most, the power of not responding. The philosopher's tone softened now. Speech seeks to convince. Silence compels belief. He looked at his listeners one by one. Remember this, every word you speak binds you to the listener's understanding, but silence binds them to yours. He approached the nearest candle and extinguished it with a slow breath. Smoke curled upward like a serpent of ink. He realized, the philosopher whispered, that words were chains, silence was the crown. The hall dimmed. Only a few flames remained. He turned away, his face now hidden in shadow. And yet, he said after a long pause, there is a danger in silence too. For when the world grows quiet enough, you begin to hear what lives inside you. The voices you buried, the truths you silenced. A faint tremor passed through the room, whether from fear or understanding, none could tell. The philosopher's voice was now barely more than a breath, and when silence turns inward, it no longer frees. It consumes. He glanced toward the darkened corridor behind him. The philosopher's voice had vanished into the stillness, leaving only the echo of his last warning, that silence, when turned inward, consumes. For a long moment, the hall remained utterly still. The remaining candles trembled in their holders as though aware of what came next. And then, with that quiet, deliberate cadence that marked all his teachings, he began again. To decode power is to dismantle yourself. The words fell like cold iron. He paced slowly before the students, his shadow stretching long across the stone floor. You have followed me through masks and obedience, betrayal and obsession. You have learned that silence is not absence but presence. Yet if you truly wish to understand power, you must be willing to turn the blade upon your own mind. He stopped and looked at them, not as a teacher to students, but as a judge to those about to be tried. Every truth uncovered, he continued softly, removes another illusion, until nothing remains to shield you from what you are. The young man who once spoke against silence now dared to ask again, what happens when there are no illusions left? The philosopher turned his gaze toward him. His eyes did not hold cruelty, only a kind of merciless compassion. Then, my son, you meet yourself. And that is the beginning of your undoing. He walked to the mirror that stood behind him, one that none had noticed before, veiled in black cloth. With a slow motion, he drew the cloth away. The glass reflected only the faint light of dying candles and the hollow faces of the listeners. This, he said, touching the mirror's edge, is the final code. Power does not exist in controlling others. It exists in stripping away every pretense until you face the truth of what drives you. Fear, desire, vanity, the hunger to matter. He gestured for one of them, a quiet woman seated near the back, to approach. She hesitated but obeyed. When she stood before the mirror, her reflection seemed distorted by the wavering light. What do you see? The philosopher asked. Myself, she answered, uncertain. No, he said. You see the sum of your illusions. The name you built, the mask you wear, the lies you told to survive. If I asked who you are without them, would you have an answer? Her lips parted, but no words came. That, the philosopher whispered, is where true awareness begins, when speech dies because there is nothing left to defend. He turned to the others. Understand this. Awareness is not freedom. It is exposure. It is the moment you realize the walls you leaned on were painted shadows, and the ground beneath your feet has never been solid. He stepped back from the mirror. His voice sank lower. At the end, there is no victor or victim, only awareness, cold and endless. For power, once decoded, dissolves the illusion of self that sought it. The woman before the mirror trembled. If everything we believe is illusion, she asked, then what remains real? The philosopher's answer came like the closing of a book. The pain, he said, only the pain. because pain cannot lie. He reached forward and drew the cloth back over the mirror. That is why those who see everything clearly wish they hadn't. The hall darkened once more. The air felt heavier, almost alive, as if the truth itself had weight. Then the philosopher spoke his final words of the night. The code is complete. But knowledge does not end, it begins to devour. What you see next will not be power's design, but the ruins it leaves behind. He blew out the last candle. The philosopher's final candle had burned out, yet no one moved. The hall was cloaked in the quiet aftermath of revelation, a silence so deep it felt alive, pulsing, waiting. From the darkness came the slow rhythm of his voice once more, softer than ever, as if speaking from somewhere between dream and memory. The final truth, all power feeds on fear. The student stiffened. The words seemed to carry a chill that no fire could warm. He stepped closer to the center of the room, the faint outline of his figure illuminated only by the distant moonlight through the tall windows. You've been taught that strength comes from control, he said, from domination, strategy, and intellect. But beneath every empire, every leader, every system, lies the same foundation: fear. He let the word echo. Those who rule do not control others by reason, he continued. They awaken what sleeps inside them, the terror of loss, of chaos, of insignificance. The wise do not need to command the fearful. They simply give their fear a name, and people will obey their own nightmares. He moved as he spoke, circling the room slowly. The weak believe fear is their enemy, something to be silenced or denied. But that denial is what makes them slaves. The powerful, however, they study fear. They listen to it. They learn the shape of its voice and the rhythm of its pulse. Because to master fear is not to destroy it. It is to love it, hold it, and make it serve you. A trembling voice rose from the dark, the same woman who had once stood before the mirror. But how can you love what tortures you? The philosopher stopped beside her. Because fear is honest, he said gently, is the only emotion that does not pretend. It reveals where you are weakest, and therefore where you are most human. He leaned closer, his words almost a whisper. The moment you deny fear, it owns you. But the moment you face it, it kneels. He straightened, his voice deepening. Think of every tyrant, every manipulator, every saint who ever held sway over the hearts of men. They all learned the same secret. People will give everything to those who promise to protect them from what they dread. Fear builds gods as easily as it builds monsters. The young man who had once doubted silence spoke now. And what if there is no one left to fear but yourself? The philosopher turned toward him, the faintest smile flickering across his lips. Then you have reached the end of the code. He raised his hand, fingers tracing the air as though writing invisible words. For the greatest power is not in ruling others, it is in standing before your own terror and refusing to flee. To see yourself, unguarded, unmasked, and still remain. The hall seemed to breathe again. Outside, thunder rolled faintly, distant, slow, like the heartbeat of something vast awakening. Fear, he said, is not your enemy. It is the proof that you are alive. Without it, you would not act, love, fight, or dream. Fear is the whisper that keeps the flame from dying. It is the shadow that reminds the light it exists. He began to walk toward the open doors of the hall. The night waited beyond, endless, silent, infinite. Before stepping out, he turned one last time. Remember what I have taught you, he said. Power is not control, nor knowledge, nor strength. It is the courage to look into the abyss and not turn away. The doors closed behind him with a slow echo that lingered long after he was gone. And in that darkness, the listeners understood. The lecture was never about the world. It was about themselves. And in the ruins of power, what remained was not fear, but awakening. The echo of the philosopher's last words lingered like smoke in the hollow hall. The night beyond the great doors pressed close, silent and heavy, as if the world itself waited to exhale. The student sat unmoving, not from reverence, but from something deeper, colder, realization. His voice had faded, but it had not left them. It lived now within the spaces between their thoughts, repeating in the tone of their own minds. The code was never hidden, it was you. For a long time, none dared speak. Then, one by one, they began to sense it, that strange, invisible shift. The hall felt different. The walls, once familiar, seemed to watch. The air carried weight, as though the philosopher's absence had become a presence of its own. He had not truly departed. His lesson was unfinished. Once you see the code, you can never unsee it. The young man who had doubted, questioned, and argued through every lecture stared at the darkened mirror draped in cloth. He thought of every word: obedience, mask, silence, fear. Each had been a fragment of something larger. Something that had not been about kingdoms or rulers or the machinery of control, but about him. He whispered the words again to himself, afraid to hear how they sounded aloud. The game of power was never about others. His reflection answered from inside of his mind. It was the mirror you refused to face. And suddenly he understood. The entire lecture, from beginning to end, had been a descent inward, not a map of manipulation, but a dismantling of illusion. The philosopher had not been teaching them to wield power over others, but to witness the architecture of their own minds, the lies they lived, the masks they wore, the fears they served. It was never a lecture. It was an awakening disguised as a warning. He rose from his seat, drawn toward the front of the hall where the last candle's smoke still curled, like memory. The others watched, but did not stop him. He reached out, trembling, and pulled away the black cloth that covered the mirror. The glass was clouded, cracked slightly at one edge, and yet what it reflected was not his body, but the sum of all his shadows. His arrogance, his envy, his need to be seen, loved, feared. Every fragment of power he had sought outside himself now stood there, shaped like his face, but older, darker, truer. He wanted to turn away, but the philosopher's warning came back, soft, patient, merciless. Once you see the code, you can never unsee it. He leaned closer. His reflection did not mimic him. It smiled, and in that silent grin, he understood the final secret. There was never a code to learn, no formula, no doctrine. The code was simply the self, naked, unmasked, stripped of all excuses. Power was not something to gain, but something to recognize. He touched the mirror. It was cold, almost alive. The reflection's smile faded, replaced by something quieter, peace, perhaps, or resignation. Behind him, the hall began to dissolve into shadow, its edges melting into the dark. The lesson was complete. There were no more teachers, no more students, only the awareness that had always been waiting behind their eyes. The young man turned away from the mirror, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of one who finally understands what cannot be forgotten. He whispered into the stillness, his voice blending with the last echo of the philosopher's own. The code was never hidden, it was me. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.